It's a little preview of
Yeah, I have a crazy tailor, and he sent me
Now
this
we're
suit.
ready. Okay. So thank you all very much for coming this evening. Welcome, virtual audience. And we are going to show off Gregg Hurwitz in his amazing tour jacket.
Okay, here we go.
Whoa. However, if any of you saw the video that Gregg sent me, that I sent out this afternoon, you don't have the fabulous drink glass or the ice cold vodka.
I don't. But you know what I do have? I have a holster built in. There is actually a holster under the pocket of the suit, and there's hidden pockets for shotgun shells. So it's good in some of the states on this tour, but not others.
We have a no guns allowed sign on the door, so if you'd come armed, we'd be doing this in the parking lot. So just as well that you did not do that. I know. When did you decide to go in for tailoring?
I met this crazy tailor who's amazing, and he made me a suit as a gift initially. I met him in London, and it has all my favorite authors. So it has Fitzgerald, it has Faulkner, it has everybody. It's in the lining, it's in the back, and he's just got this crazy innovative mind. I mean, one of the other things he did with this jacket is there's slits in the back for if you're shooting skeet. So it's actually a shooting jacket. So it's incredibly comfortable. But his mind is just absolutely wild. So I said, look, just make me stuff and send it to me. And I just unleashed him. It's a great thing to do with people who are creative or have a strong entrepreneurial streak is you just say, go do all the stuff that you most want to do and just send it along.
Oh my God, shooting jacket. This is one of my favorite stories ever. Stephen Hunter, for any of you who might know Stephen Hunter, he's an author who's a real gun guy. He's written fabulous books. But anyway, at one point, long before COVID, Stephen announced that he was going to bring guns, so he wanted people to be able to admire them. So I thought, well, if he's going to bring guns, we should really, set it up so we could have a little shooting gallery. I did not know that you could get a permit from the city of Scottsdale so you could have a shooting gallery in our parking lot. So everybody who was here at the store went out to the parking lot and everybody got a shot.
Really?
Although it was not live ammunition, it was some sort of dummy. Yeah, it was hilarious.
Now I'm feeling a little bit meager about my jacket.
No, but
at this point, it feels a little bit. Yeah, okay.
I can set it up next time.
All right, we'll do it.
So when you bring your shooting
Is he a really
jacket,
good? I'd imagine Stephen Hunter's a great shot, huh?
That's a really good question. I don't remember that Stephen actually shot anything.
Oh, really?
No.
He's one of the great, his books have the greatest sniper scenes of anybody.
They really do.
James Thayer wrote a book called White Star.
That's
I don't know
right.
if you remember White
Yep.
Star. That was a sniper on sniper book way back in the day that was wonderful. But Hunter, man, swagger, he can write sniper scenes.
Oh.
He is wonderful.
I found in my garage, I know we're way off topic, but we'll get to the book.
This is what we do, Barbara.
This is what we do. We have to we fill an hour because you all took the trouble to come, and we can only talk about the actual plot of the book for a very short time, so we digress. But anyway, I realized that I had these cartons in my garage which were filled with old advanced reading copies that I've had for forever. I found A Killing Floor, for example, Lee Child, and Michael Connelly's early books, whatever. And in there, I found my favorite Stephen Hunter book ever, which is called The 47 Samurai. And Swagger's a gun guy, right?
Yeah.
And so Swagger is in Japan, and he's going to go up against a samurai sword guy, right? So how's that going to work? So I'm reading through that arc. I've even marked the page, and I got to something on page, I don't remember what it was. Anyway, and it flashed in front of me how Stephen was going to do this. So I put the arc down. I went in and wrote Stephen, and I said, I'm on page, let's call it 67. And I see what's going to happen. And he wrote back, he went, shit. But in fact, he brought it off that Swagger could go up against a samurai sword guy.
If I had a sniper rifle, I probably could too. I mean, just between us.
He didn't have a gun.
Okay, fair.
No, he didn't have a gun. He had a sword. So the question was,
really?
How is Swagger going to win a sword fight with an experienced Japanese? And anyway, I figured it out. It was brilliant. So let's talk about you, because we're not totally off topic.
Yeah.
Because
I didn't fly in here to talk about Stephen Hunter the whole time, okay?
I was craftily leading up to
Okay. It's a
Tommy
funnel
Sojak.
introduction.
That's right. Leading up to Tommy Sojak, who is a weapons guy and a gun guy, right?
He
He's
is.
a key a key player in this book. So I wasn't really off topic.
No, you were artfully bringing it around as you do. It's the Barbara Peters boomerang effect, we call it.
Absolutely.
Tommy Stojak is Evan's best and closest friend he's had. He's the first person he was friends with after he was raised by, he's taken out of a foster home at the age of 12. He was trained up to be an assassin. He had a father figure, Jack Johns, but his first friend who he made is Tommy Stojak. And Tommy's he's an avuncular figure. He's got a very colorful vocabulary. I might have received an incredibly nasty review today on Amazon, which I noted from a reader who is horrified. I say horrified by Tommy Stojak's language. And I assume she's never met anybody in the Navy. But he is fantastic. And he knows he's a better shooter than Evan. He's his ordnance guy. He's his most trusted friend. And Nemesis is about when their two codes are on a collision course, when their two codes collide. And so Evan, who's had this lifelong journey from the age of 12, Jack John said to him, the hard part isn't making you a killer. The hard part is keeping you human. And part of being human means you start to view other people as being more human. And this is the first time that his code has collided with somebody in a way where he's going after and hunting down his best friend in the world, and vice versa, because Tommy ain't a shrinking violet. And so this is this for the 10th book is a very big cross. I wanted to name this book, the 10th book, X, which is perfect for a 10th book in a series. But my publisher said, and you'll probably agree, yeah, look at you shaking your head. They probably called Barbara and got back to me and said, we're not calling it X. You can't sell a book as well that's just a letter. But Nemesis is kind of great because in a lot of ways, we're not sure if the Nemesis in this is Tommy or if it's Evan.
Absolutely true. But, the thing is that no matter how much you want to make Evan sort of a lone wolf as he was trained to be, you can't really do that, can you? There are people in his life, people in his building. You always have a great scene with the difficult woman. I can't think of her name at the moment.
Ida Rosenbaum.
Ida, right. So, where would we be without Ida
we
for
would be
a little relief?
doomed. She's the highly strident elderly Jewish woman who lives upstairs, who may or may not be based on my late grandmother, may she rest in peace, who's an exceedingly difficult woman who's always screaming at Evan. Evan will come home from like a shootout, and he'll be like bleeding, he'll be cut and bleeding and trying to hide it. And he's in the elevator and she's like lambasting him for having an oil leak from his truck in the garage. And so she's constantly like, she's the queen of quotidian concerns. So that's always when he moves out from the archetypal world of the thriller hero that he is. And he moves back into like these fucking HOA meetings that he can't stand.
Exactly.
And they're debating what should the pile be of the carpet that we're going to replace in the lobby area. And he's getting death threats. Ida's always on the forefront of that charge.
The smaller the stake, the higher the tension. Some of you probably live in HOAs. We had a lot of drama in our HOA last year. And, they have surprising power. Right. So
they're terrible. Well, it's like it's my favorite joke about academia, which is, why are academic squabbles so fierce?
Because the stakes are so low. Right. That, Tony Hillerman's Thief of Time is his Edgar-winning book, and it was in fact about academics digging up pots or whatever it was in New Mexico and a fraud that ensued. And when I taught crime fiction at ASU, I assigned the students that book, and they were incredulous. They were incredulous that anybody would have cared for a promotion on the faculty. They just couldn't believe it. It was so funny. It was like, seriously, this is a mystery.
So good.
Yeah. Well, anyway, you have very high stakes in this book. But Evan has kind of, let me think, what do we want to call his young... Is he
his
sort
charge,
of mentoring or whatever?
Josephine Morales. She's sort of his charge. She calls him his uncle person, and they're equal parts. I think he's like an older brother and an uncle, and increasingly like a father figure to her. Hellbent is the book where I introduced her. It's the third book in the series, and part of that's the series where Jack Johns, we learn of Jack's demise. And I think looking back at that book, it's really a lot about that Evan loses a father figure and has to become a father figure. And I was supposed to kill Joey at the end of that book. And those of you who have read the series will see, like, right that moment. There's a moment right there where it's laid out, and I couldn't do it because I was writing her, and she brought all these facets out in Evan. It was like she's like the light that shined through him and brought out all those facets in this jewel. There was so much of his vulnerability. There was so much texture, and she brought all of that. And I just thought, I can't. This dynamic is so great. It was so funny. It added so much to him that I kept her alive. It's a lot like Robert Crace talks about how in The Monkey's Raincoat he was supposed to kill Joe Pike. And he always says it was the best financial decision I ever made not to kill Joe Pike. But it was a very similar thing. I just couldn't kill Joey. And in a lot of ways, in the series, I really think that she's the number 2 in a lot of ways. You know, if Spencer has Hawk and Elvis has Joe Pike, in a very weird way, Evan's got Josephine Morales, who's this mouthy, pain-in-the-ass kid. It's the last thing he ever wanted in his life. And she just has a way of, like, forcing him into a greater humanity. She's so tough, and she's so vulnerable, and she's a delight to write.
But don't you think there's some symmetry? And after all, he was mentored by a really wonderful person. And so, in a way, don't you think it's good that he's paying it forward?
Well, I guess so, because I've been doing it for
Right.
7 books after I was planning not to.
That's
So
right.
it's like you knowing what was going to happen with that samurai fight. I think you knew this ahead of me, maybe. I got all the way to that scene.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's funny. One of the biggest turns I had, I kept putting off writing this first Orphan X book. I wrote another book first and another and another. I wanted to really make sure if I was going to write a character, you know, because I grew up, the acknowledgments in Orphan X, I sort of think all my favorite fictional heroes, from like Beowulf all the way back through, you know, I list about, you know, several dozen of them. And I really thought if I want to have a character who's in this, who I hope could someday be in this pantheon with Bond and with Reacher and with Bourne, I wanted to really make sure I had a handle on all the things that would make him distinctive, right? Not like where does he sleep? What's his bed like? What's that symbolize? What does he drink? What's his dialogue like? What's he look like? What is his engagement? What's an action sequence that distinguishes it from a Jason Bourne action sequence? All those pieces. And really one of the biggest turns I had was this realization that if he's taken out of a foster home at the age of 12 and trained to be an assassin, that on its own is not a wildly innovative premise, right? David Morrell has played in those waters. Black Widow for Marvel has played in those waters. And so when I was thinking about what I would do to take, because what we do all the time in crime fiction is we take tropes and we reinvent and reinvigorate them, right? That's the delight and that's the joy. I was just reading a Ross MacDonald book, and God, the way he winks at Chandler, you know, and kind of nods at Hammett, and he's got a little bit of James M. Cain, and then you see after him you have, you know, Robert B. Parker pulling Spencer into the real world, and then you have Connolly after him. But I really thought, what if this guy is taken out of this foster home, and instead of it being this terrible experience, right, where he's just tortured and he's an expendable weapon and he's viewed, if Jack Johns really loves this kid, if he loves this kid and he's a father figure to him, and he wants nothing more than for him to stay human, and he puts him in the world. So he goes from this East Baltimore, you know, foster home, and he's learning foreign languages, and he's learning eskrima knife fighting, and he's learning etiquette for Russia, because he has to know that if he goes there so he doesn't get killed. And so that sort of embrace of his humanity and that central mission of becoming more and more human and learning, I say the one thing he never learned, he was never taught to learn the strange language of intimacy. And if that's something that he's questing for, then of course it makes sense that someone will come beneath him where he's not just moving towards it, but he has to lead and engage and has more responsibility lowered on his shoulders to try and embody that himself for somebody who's up and who's behind him in a lot of ways, which is Joey. So
Yeah. Well, you've been thinking about it. Greg and I have been doing this together for 25 years. We were just remembering that. And when you were before X, we would talk.
I think we sent it to you in manuscript form. Keith
Mhm.
sent it over to
Yep.
you. You know, I spend more waking hours with Evan than I do with my family. I mean, that's what happens with work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about your job. So I better find someone who's compelling and where it's interesting. I also don't think it's a coincidence that I started these books right when I was on the cusp of 40. And, you know, Evan's got his 10 Assassin's Commandments. Assume nothing. You know, how you do anything's how you do everything. That tends to be a favorite. You know, never make it personal. If you don't know what to do, do nothing, which is his and my least favorite, as presumably men of action. But really, Orphan X opens where he breaks all 10 of those commandments. The first book is right at the point where he's got this sort of rigid worldview that he's been raised in, and it's right at the moment that he shatters all of the rules by which he's always been supposed to live into a new definition of himself. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that I did that kind of at the cusp of 40 myself, because that's kind of what you're doing. You know, you're looking at what you hope is going to be the back half, and you're figuring out what things to let go of. What are the rules that have governed me? You know, what are the survival instincts? It's easy when you're in your 20s and 30s to get rid of the habits that are shitty, right? If you're a lousy drunk, if you have a temper, if you, whatever those things are. But it's really hard when you have to let go of the things that have benefited you, that have defined you, that have given you your definition. It's one of the things we have to figure out in the back half of our life that maybe no longer serve us now. And so Orphan X really opens up on him deciding to shatter through all of these things in a quest to understand different parts of himself and who he is. And so, you know, I kind of have this series about somebody trying to figure out how to become more human and how to understand textures and shades of gray, but it's wrapped in a thriller series. And so,
but see, you had thought about all that before you wrote X. Lots of people start a series and create some guy, and then they learn him as they go along, or they evolve him as they go along. But you really knew X before Evan, I should call him, before you wrote Orphan X.
I took some time for sure, and I made sure that I knew what things were distinguishing, but I've learned a ton also. I remember when I first pitched the series, I told my agent, I said, you know, so there's this 1-855 to nowhere number. By the way, Scott Brick, who's my audiobook reader, who's fantastic, I sent him the manuscript before I even sold the book, and he if you call 1-855 to nowhere, Evan Smoke answers the phone. So you got to try that. It's kind of cool. But so I had this sort of plan, and I remember pitching my agent, and I said, look, it's this encrypted number, and people are going to call when they're in desperate need. They have nowhere to turn, and he's going to be there for them. He's like this pro bono assassin. He's got unlimited resources, a highly unusual skill set, and he wants to apply it to help people align with his own moral compass. And I said, in one of these days, that phone's going to ring. He never knew his parents. You know, he's an orphan. He's a foster. I said, and the person on the other end is going to say, Evan, it's your mother. And I still remember my agent, Lisa Erbach Vance, said, oh, I love that story. When are you going to write it? I didn't get to that till the 6th book in the series. That was Prodigal Son. And part of that was I had to learn him more and have it be where that kind of shock is more meaningful, right? If I did that in the 2nd book, it doesn't have that sort of impact. So I've learned a lot, you know, as I have, you know, ideally grown up and evolved since turning 40 and, you know, moved into different sorts of understanding. The same thing happens with him. And so it's been amazing to write sort of side by side with a character who's trying to discover and push boundaries as I'm trying to figure them out myself. And it's weird. One of my favorite quotations about writing is from Joan Didion. And she says, I write so I know what I think. And there's so much of the time when I'm writing, it's like something I'm kind of masticating on in my head psychologically. And it just comes out in a plot. I never think abstractly. I'm never thinking, well, now I want to write a theme about betrayal and let me figure out the book. I'm writing from scenes and character and action and snippets of dialogue and character moments and story. But it all comes back, if I trace the roots down, a lot of times it is something that I'm really contending with in a different way, and I'm writing to figure my way towards it. And so it's been a nice relationship, me and him.
It has been a wonderful relationship, and you never have lunch by yourself.
It's true. And he's kept me full of Rhodesian Ridgebacks in the house too. He's been very lucrative. There's a lot of dog food in the house that we're required with four Ridgebacks, 3 Ridgebacks, and a mutt who thinks she's a Ridgeback. So.
Isn't that true that the smaller the dog, the bigger the dog thinks it is? We have a little Cavapoo. He will take on a Great Dane. He would take on an elephant.
They're insane. You look at them, and it's insane. And they'll go submissive. They play with her. It's incredible. But no, we have 400 pounds of dogs. So, I mean, the main reason I'm writing now is just to pay for the fucking dog food.
Yep.
I mean, just to be honest with you.
They're so expensive. So we've talked about character, but let's talk a little bit about all the, like designing Evan's very cool residence. There's so many, you've done weaponry, you've done architecture, you've done all this stuff. So you like learning things, don't you?
I love learning things.
Yeah.
I mean, look, being a writer is the greatest It's the greatest way to be a dilettante. I mean, I think one of my primary traits probably is curiosity. Like if something fascinates me, I just want to go in and wander into all these dark corners and shine a light into them. And so that's been a lot of the research. I've gone undercover into mind control cults. I get to go on to demolition ranges with SEALs and blow up cars. I go up in stunt airplanes. I get to do all of that.
Right.
And so part of this was I wanted Evans, you're mentioning his apartment. He's got this penthouse and it's very cold and it's very modern and it's very sleek and it's very sterile. And when it's very contrasted with when he goes downstairs, Mia Hall, who is the single mother district attorney who lives downstairs, that's a constant will they, won't they push-pull tension, because if she ever knows really who he is, she has to arrest him. But her, she's raising this boy who, when the series started, was 8, and now he's 10 because he ages much slower than we do. But it's always this like beautiful mess, right? There's this mess and intimacy. There's like crayons mashed into the carpet, and there's laundry, and there's dishes, and there's colors, and there's candles that are scented, and there's throw pillows, and it's this amazing thing for Evan to encounter. But then he goes up, and his place is OCD clean. And when we're talking about learning things in this book, I actually realized for the first time why. So Evan sleeps on a bed that is a floating bed. It's a slab of steel, and it's propelled by incredibly powerful magnets, and it's tethered to the floor with steel cables. And if you cut the cables, it would just explode through the roof from the magnets. And it's a real bed. It cost $1.6 million, I think. And so if I didn't have to pay for dog food, I would get that bed probably. But I always had this image in my mind, and it's a seminal image for the series, and people ask me about it all the time, and they're fascinated, and people want to know, do I have the bed? And this book, for the first time, I kind of realized when we're talking about figuring things out, why he has that bed. And there's a moment where Tommy, in this book, Tommy goes to this, Tommy's from a rural town, and so he goes back to a town that's a lot like the town that he's from. And Evan grew up in East Baltimore. He's kind of a more urban guy, urban operator. And these kids that Tommy's caught up in when Evan's going after him are really problematic. They think they're in a militia, but they're really just kind of dipshits, right? They think that they're racist, but they're not even really good at that. Like they just can't, they're figuring stuff out and making terrible decisions. And when Tommy confronts Evan, or Evan confronts Tommy, one of the things Tommy says to him is, he says, do you remember the bed in the Odyssey? Odysseus's bed, his bed with Penelope, is a severed tree trunk. The base of the bed is a tree trunk with the roots that go all the way to the earth. And that bed is the center of the house, and it's the center of the family, and it's the center of the community. And that is the weight, that's the gravitas that when Odysseus goes out on his journey, it always brings him back home to Penelope and back to that bed. And he says, these boys, they don't have any, there's no bed here. There's no grounding here for them. He's trying to tell it to Evan. And we have this realization, me included, in real time, that Evan's bed that floats is because he's between different worlds. He's also not grounded. He's an orphan. He was raised to be an expendable weapon. He's never been grounded and seated in something like a family. And so the imagery kind of snapped into place for me when I was writing this book. And it's always lovely when that happens, of like, oh, it wasn't just a clever little twist. It actually had a little bit more heat to it.
How high is the bed?
3 feet off the ground.
Okay.
Or 2 feet, depending on how accurate my copy editor has been in certain drafts.
I'm just asking in case Evan, was really busted up. Would he be able to climb into the bed? But if it's that low,
he tumbles onto it.
he will be okay.
Though I did have a lot of fun. I like to play with. One of the things I do is, I like to set up the archetype and the action and the motifs of him. One of them is when he answers the phone, he says, "Do you need my help?" And the floating bed is another one. So when I got to the 5th book, I can start to play with those notions in a way that's really fun. And I have a scene in one of them where, Evan's got these original SWAT boots and they have steel toes, and the sheets are wrinkled, and he's got OCD. And he's trying to straighten the sheets, but he pulls the wrinkle, and then it wrinkles across there, and he goes around the bed and he straightens that one, and then his boot gets sucked under, and he goes hammered on his back, and his boots fly up, and he lands crash on the ground, and he can't do anything. He's trying to figure out what the hell to do. So he takes his boots off, and he goes downstairs to his truck, his Ford F-150. In the vaults in the truck there, he's got a non-sparking crowbar, which you use sometimes in demolition breaching because sparks aren't good when you're demolition breaching. and he's got a sock on, and he's got one boot on, and he's on the elevator, and of course Peter's there, and he's staring at the boot, and he looks like a crazy person, and he gets the crowbar and he goes back, and as he's prying it, the other boot that he still has on flies under, and he slams again on his back, and he's laying on his back, and the phone rings, and he answers the phone, and he says, "Do you need my help?" And it was this fun way of that's where we're all inside a sort of community in a world where we get to joke with that. We get to play with that all together. And that's a fun part too, when you settle into a character who you get to revisit. And that's
very true. Now, I have done a very poor job with the technology in the bookstore, and now it's too cold. You're right. So I am going to, fix it. Hang on.
All right.
All
In the
right.
meantime, I'm going to do some performance art.
Okay. Actually, I did have something clever I wanted to ask you. What was it? One of the things that I particularly like are your action scenes. And the one that I reread currently more often than usual is the one where the President of the United States thinks he's invulnerable and Evan gets him. That is one of your absolutely best orchestrated, scenes from start to finish about how he executes that. If you haven't read that book, I won't spoil it for you, but how do you figure all that out?
Well, it's called Out of the Dark. That's my fourth book in the series.
Right.
It's my homage to Day of the Jackal, which is one of my favorite thrillers. And I really enjoyed the new Peacock series too. I thought they did a nice job updating that. And so I wanted Evan to go after this sort of, horribly corrupt president of the United States. I wrote that before any current political predicaments.
Nevertheless, it's satisfying to read.
Yeah, really and truly. I feel like it's important for me to say that. I was worried that the Secret Service would come to my door because I was doing a lot of searches of hotels with balconies that face the White House. I mean, my Google search is just insane. But the action sequences, to me, each action sequence should be like a little 3-act play. They have to be structured internally. It can't just be, oh, here's another shootout in a warehouse. Here's another car chase. And so for me, there's a couple things. They have to be structured. They have to speak to character, meaning that Evan in an action sequence has to engage in that differently than anybody else. And so it's different. It can't just be a James Bond sequence. It can't just be a Bourne sequence. Everything has to come back to character. Character is what matters to us more than anything. If I ask you guys, what's your favorite James Bond action sequence? Everyone pauses and thinks for a minute, but we all know how he takes his martini. The character stuff is closest to heart. And so when Evan's engaged in an action sequence, it has to be structured. It has to have something to do with character, and he has to engage with it in a way that only he would engage with. And if I have those pieces, then I feel like I've built something where we're not slowing down character development. I don't like reading or going to movies where you just pause and then there's sort of like a generic, we get action fatigue a lot, especially in movies these days, I feel like, where you're in that never-ending third act. You just feel like you're getting punched in the face with action. If you don't have character beats that are essential to that all the way through, a current example, based on the novel, and it's the remake of an original, but I love the Tony Scott, Denzel Washington, Creasy Man on Fire. And every scene in Man on Fire is about character. That movie, by the way, a first act in a screenplay is usually 30 pages, 30 minutes. As an hour-long first act, it's all about his relationship with that little girl. And so when that coil is compressed and when it springs, we're completely invested in it on the basis of character and relationship.
Well, I'm going to say something here about Gregg's prose because I think, a writer learns to write by writing, right? So when you came to Orphan X, you already had developed a great prose style. But one of the reasons, leaving all political things aside, I like that scene where Evan is talking to the president is there is not a single extra word. Your pacing in it is flawless. The dialogue is flawless. It's such a pleasure to read a writer who is really in command of his craft, who really, there's never a wasted word. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. That's lovely.
Well, I mean it seriously. One of the, for years, when we opened the bookstore, this is our 35th year, but we were over on Main Street, not then at the Horse's Ass, as I used to give that as directions to people at Marshall Way, but before that, in the old days, people actually would buy books to fly and, take with them on the plane. So it was not unusual for somebody, a car would pull up outside, somebody would dash into the bookstore and they'd say, quick, give me an airplane book. So we went with Nelson DeMille, The Charm School, which was just a fabulous book. And, we sold, I don't even know how many of them or whatever. And not too long ago, after COVID, and people were wandering in and out, I thought we need to revive that. So our book now is Orphan X. That's the book that we keep in stock to hand to anybody who comes in and says, quick, give me an airplane book, or, thriller, whatever. So, yay.
It's quite an honor. Me and Nelson DeMille, take it.
I miss Nelson. I do. Yeah, I know. One trouble with being in business for 35 years is that people age out. Me too, for that matter. But
you're still in the game, Barbara.
Still. Anyway, what other nice things can I say about you? I've talked about your prose. I've talked about the pacing.
I have some suggestions.
Okay.
If you'd like, I brought some prepared remarks.
Right. So I do have a question. When you sold X, was it like what? Like a 3? Publishers don't generally give you like a 10-book contract. That's way too. What's the word I want? Anyway, they don't do that.
Extravagant. Yeah.
Well, optimistic would be probably the word I would use. So, what did you start out with? What, like a 3-book contract?
What's wild is I moved over. I was with a lot of publishers early in my career. So I think this is my 26th novel. I started really young, and I was very fortunate early. So I've never had to have a real job. I've only got to play my whole life,
Right.
which has been amazing. And so it's part of why I work so hard, because it never feels like work. But I had done 2 3-book deals with Minotaur, my current publisher here, and when I stepped aside for a number of reasons and just wrote Orphan X on spec, which means I could have got a deal in advance, but I wanted to write it to make sure that they got the series and loved the series and knew the series, not just they were continuing with me. And then we took it back out, and then I wound up back with Minotaur with my current publisher again. They wanted them, but I only did a 2-book deal because it was sort of like, let's see if this thing flies. And I was here, in fact, on the Orphan X launch, coming to see you. And I was at Valley Ho up the street here, which is one of my favorite hotels. It's a lovely, lovely place. And I got a call from my agent, and she just said, look, I've been out, 3 days by the time I see you, usually 1 day, because the book came out yesterday. And she said they want to extend you for 3 more books. And it was like a really substantial different offer. So the second book hadn't even come out yet. And then they took me out for 3 more. And that was sort of, it did this. And then it's just been amazing. I mean, there's been an amazing readership. And, nothing gives me more joy than having a book be received and having it mean something to people, and, showing up and having people come out. And it's a total delight. And so it just kind of grew. It did really well from the gates. It kind of came out and then exploded out, and it's just kind of been a steady movement upward, and you can't really ask for much more in the world of publishing.
Well, the reason I brought that up is, you can say with confidence that there are things that you can develop. You can look ahead as long as you know that, you're not on the brink of being canceled. So I always like to let people go away with the idea that there will be a new book. So, we're going to move towards book 11.
Yep. Book 11's already in the can.
Oh, isn't that good news? Yay. Right. Always a great feeling in case he's hit by, a Waymo on the way back to the valley. Oh.
Yeah, I'm glad to be able to do that for all of you.
Speaking of Waymos, have you seen any of them driving around town?
The little delivery robot?
No. It's a Jaguar.
Oh,
yeah, it's a Jaguar with a blue top. And Austin, San Francisco, and Phoenix are the...
those things?
Yeah. But the point is that not long ago, and it was greatly exaggerated, turned out, but some guy took a Waymo to the airport, and the car didn't want to let him out, so he just drove around the airport. And apparently and he was beginning to read Mrs. Flight. Apparently there is some kind of a red or call button or something, and you can, and if you're fortunate, a real person will answer it and stop the car, which is what happened for him. But I was thinking to myself, what a brilliant thing that would be for one of your guys, to get trapped in the car, or the car gets hijacked. And, there we are.
It also sounds like a great Samuel Beckett play. You're just circling the airport. So one of my friends is a brilliant computer chip design, engineer. He designed the chip for the iPhone, and he ran the self-driving division for Elon Musk. So he's created the fastest computer chip in history like 4 or 5 times. And he's great, but he's also a stunt pilot, and he's a great human. But one of the things that I did in one of the Orphan X books is I named a character after him, and then I had him killed by a commandeered Tesla that ran him over. I hacked a Tesla and just ran him over. It was great. It was so delightful.
If you're writing a thriller, you have to keep up with modern weaponry and technology. And I thought, a car has now become, you can hack the car.
And there's no greater delight than creatively murdering your friends.
Well, that's sort of an Easter egg for you, at least in the book, right?
Yes.
Right. So any sign of a movie deal or one you could talk about? Or did you sign an NDA and you can't talk about it?
It's not an NDA, but yeah, I have just steered the series in with very competent stewardship. I held it back for a while. I adapted it out once a couple times, but I have it back. I have a great new team. We're going to announce something soon, but it was really important for me to figure out the right team around this, and I think I've located that. So stay tuned. There will be news coming soon when we announce it.
Oh, that's very exciting. Well, on that note, yay. So we can't really talk about what happens with Evan and Tommy, but all the reviews have said that there's a dramatic turn in Evan's life. So you're going to head in a different direction in book 11?
Yes, it's a drastic change is going to happen at the end of this book. Nothing's going to be the same in Evan's world after Nemesis.
Well, and thank God you already know the book 11 is done, right? So you won't be left wondering forever what actually happened. How about questions? Would you like to take questions, Greg?
I'd be happy to.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Would you repeat the question?
Yep.
I like reading about areas I know, and my son lives right near Evan. But I also, Robert Dugoni and I grew up in the same town. He went to your rival high school. Have you written anything or plan on writing anything about the West Bay?
All right. Have I written anything about the Bay Area? Basically, my first book called The Tower takes place in San Francisco, the San Francisco Bay Area. And I have a book called Tell No Lies that is it's not quite in the South Bay, but Tell No Lies is my dirty little love letter to San Francisco. And in a lot of ways, The Crime Writer is my love letter to Los Angeles, and Tell No Lies is my love letter to San Francisco. Now, Robert Dugoni, who's a terrific guy and a terrific writer, went to my rival high school, Sarah, and we used to absolutely trounce them in everything. It was just unbelievable. Like, we'd go in for track meets and we beat them like 135-1. They'd have like some like wheezing guy would take third in the shot put. It was just pathetic. But the thing that's amazing with Sarah is, which Bob reminds me at every turn, is of their graduates, Lynn Swan, Tom Brady, and Barry Bonds. And so Sarah's always got it over my high school. No matter how much we might be in the win column, they have 3 all-time athletes. It's an amazing school. Yeah.
So Bob was just here Saturday. Now I'm formulating an idea that maybe if we can have you and Bob together next book, duke it out all over again.
That'd be great.
It would be fun.
He's terrific,
He's
and what a
lovely
talent
guy.
he is too. Any other questions? Yes.
So you always like to learn. Have you ever thought of changing Evan's drink of choice?
Have I ever?
Since you get so much sent to you.
Have I thought of changing Evan's drink of choice since I have so much sent into him? Well, you might recall that in one of the books, Evan drinks a gin. Do you remember this? He's challenged by Luke Devine, who's his, he's a billionaire genius who makes Elon look incredibly sane and steady, because Luke's really careens around, and if he has any guardrails, they're very wide. And he challenges Evan. He thinks Evan has this affectation around vodka. Evan gets made fun of a lot for his vodka choice. And he says, why don't you, I dare you to pick another drink. And so Evan picks a gin that, in my estimation, is the finest gin in the world. So we'll take a moment to respect and honor gin. So everybody thinks that gin is a British drink because what's more British than gin? But in fact, it's Dutch. Barbara knows this, of course.
It's called Jennifer,
Yeah,
actually. The
that's
Dutch
right.
word is, yeah.
But people who aren't Barbara Peters don't know that gin is in fact Dutch. And there's a gin called Bobby's. So I went to a book tour in Holland, and the menus there, it's like Spain does a version of this, but in Holland in particular, the entire menu is gin. It's gins, and then it's what the mix is going to be, like what kind of tonic it's going to be, and then what else goes in it. And so I set out to drink every possible combination of gin and tonic within like a 5-week book tour, which was spectacular. I did for you, for the sake of you readers, I performed in Herculean fashion. And the greatest gin in the world is a gin called Bobby's, and it has all this Indonesian spices like cardamom from the Indonesian Dutch trade, and you pour it with elderflower tonic, and then you do it with a slice of orange. And if you pour the gin and the tonic slowly through the slice of orange, it's transcendent. It's unlike any gin and tonic you've ever had. It's a completely different class of drink almost. And so that was one of his first experimentations outside the lanes of vodka.
We're going to have to set that up next time he's here, right? Right
Yeah.
here. We can
Would you
do
rather
that.
have gin and tonics or shooting in the parking lot?
Well, both would be extremely dangerous. I know.
I will say, when I was in college, we had a festival that we called Guns and Beer, where one of my college roommates had a ranch in Sudbury, and we'd go out and drink beer and shoot skeet. But I don't think that's highly recommended by the NRA parameters. But maybe we'll do gin and tonics and shooting.
That sounds absolutely terrific. Yeah. We'll have the Waymo deliver, right? No, I really like that idea, right? You know, the Dutch are responsible for a lot of stuff. You remember David Liss, a wonderful author? He wrote a brilliant book about the South Sea bubble collapse, a thriller set in 1720, whatever it was, and it won the Edgar, which was, astonishing to everybody because oftentimes historical fiction doesn't. But for a second book, the Dutch had a monopoly on tulips. You probably already know about, the whole tulip bust and the whole bit. But the Dutch cornered the coffee market. So David decided that he would bring coffee and prepare it for all of us at his event the way the Dutch did it. It's the most disgusting thing I have ever tried to drink. They didn't grind. I'm trying to remember. They broke the beans with a hammer, and they steeped them in red wine, and the water was cold. And when you tried to drink it, the coffee beans stuck in your teeth. It was just horrible. And, I've often wondered how they managed to, because gin is what? Juniper berries, isn't it? I think that it's juniper berries, although you can change all kinds of other stuff. Why the Dutch have had this kind of thing about drinks and unusual stuff, to make it with or do something with. But coffee was a huge monopoly for a while with them. They kind of went from monopoly to monopoly. But then they blew it because they traded this little teeny island called Run, R-U-N. Tiny little island. They traded it for Manhattan because that's where cloves were. Cloves were grown in Run. And cloves were rumored to be medicine. They had aphrodisiacal qualities.
Cloves?
Yeah. Or was it nutmeg? But I think it was cloves. Anyway, rum was the only place that it grew. So the British, I just reread this book called Nathaniel's Nutmeg. It's the only reason I'm actually able to say all this. The British then skunked the Dutch. Not only did they get Manhattan, but they went to Run, and it was the soil in only one tree, only grew on Run. They dug it all up, like the breadfruit tree that and they took it back to Kew Garden. They did that with the rubber tree. They went, to Manaus.
Yeah, the Brits are incredible.
They were biotanical. Is this the word I want? Botanical. Yeah, botanical pirates. They really were.
They're
well,
incredible.
that was a digression for you. Top that.
I won't ever make you eat smashed coffee beans steeped in red wine.
I can't tell you how absolutely horrible that was.
I'm definitely not giving you guns after I serve you that.
Think how much better it would have been if David had brought us gin. It would have been a whole different experience, right? Anyone else?
Do you have an actor in your mind that you'd like to see play Evan?
Do I have an actor in my mind who I could see play Evan? What's really weird is that I have So I describe Evan in every book. I say average size, average build, just an ordinary guy, not too handsome. And I sort of repeat that. It was really funny because the first time I adapted the books was for Bradley Cooper. And at my first signing, one of my friends who's a screenwriter raised his hand. He said, "Is this the easiest adaptation you've ever done? Did you just cross out not too handsome and then turn it into a screenplay?" But one of the things I've thought a lot about is I'm such a fan of casting that is surprising or different. One of the problems, what's great when you get a movie star is you get a movie star and the movie gets made and it opens and there's great box office and they're key for a green light. But I really love casting that surprises us. And so, for instance, the new Reacher casting of a relative unknown, there's something that's much more captivating that draws us in a lot more, where we feel like he's the character mapped onto it rather than that we're seeing a movie star play a role. So I'm interested in possibly finding somebody new. In my head, the people are like Joseph Gordon-Levitt from 10 years ago or James McAvoy from 10 years ago, because he's got a similar look. I mean, clearly he's got to be handsome and appealing in a manner because that's the energy that he has. The other thing that I really like the idea of is I always find it exciting when somebody is cast opposite type. And, you know, there's a couple examples of that. I remember the first time that I saw Independence Day and Will Smith had his shirt off and was dragging an alien across the desert. And everyone was like, "That's the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air." Like, people couldn't even believe it because he was this sort of goofy rapper, you know, kid that nobody saw, and he just was emerged as this leading man. The other case is Bryan Cranston, who is the dad from Malcolm in the Middle, and his casting in Breaking Bad was just spectacular. And so I'm interested in seeing if we can find somebody who can step into the role and feel really sort of surprising and new in that role, rather than we're just capturing somebody who might be a bit more obvious for it.
Are you going to do any writing of screenplays?
No, not for this round. I got too far out. I adapted it when Bradley was attached. I adapted it early days because I'd written Orphan X, I'd written The Nowhere Man, I was starting Hellbent. And one of the things I realized is the books continue to go back to get my brain to reset the whole universe at the beginning again. It's too tricky. I mean, I'm 11 books deep in my head now. So the resetting, I need somebody else now to take it and just own it and be brilliant. And I'm going to be there as a resource, and they can just plug in. You know, I need this, you know, to point them to the right action sequence, to the right scenes, to sort of help guide and just be there as a resource to somebody else who's got to take it and own it and make it their own.
So ultimately, you can cash the check.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, that's the
that's
aim.
a good thing. And it's always important to remember, no matter how you feel about a book that's been adapted, is the book is still the book. It doesn't really matter, you know, in many senses, whether the screenplay is
You
true
always
to
got the book on the shelf. It's
You
true.
do. Right.
Whereas if your screenplay gets made and it's shitty, it's really sad because all you have is a shitty movie.
Well, on that note. All right, one more
Yes.
question.
Let's do two more. These two.
More.
Yes.
All right.
Have I thought about writing a standalone book about Joey or Candy? I've done short stories, like long short stories with Joey. The longest one was the recital that came out a little while ago. It's a blast. I mean, I've certainly given it some thought. Candy's so much fun to write. But, you know, Evan really centers the books for me in a lot of ways. So I'm not sure that a full-length novel's on the horizon, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out.
One more.
Yeah.
Yeah, between Lone Wolf and Nemesis, I think I've consumed like 9 Gray Man books waiting for your next one. And I'm just so bummed, right? They got Ryan Gosling, they got Chris Evans, they had this movie, it went straight to Netflix type thing. And it's just such a bummer because it looks like it's going to end with one. Like Gosling's doing Andy Weir. Are they doing more?
I know the problem
They're
with it.
building out a world from it, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
He's doing Andy Weir, who did The Martian.
Yeah.
He's doing that next, and I don't know if there's anything on the rise, but either way, like that would be crushing. I think to have one, Orphan X movie and then be done. kind of thing.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know. Could you speak to that, or have you thought of that, or
Yeah, so he's talking about how you get a book, an adaptation made that then turns into a franchise. You got to knock the first one out of the park. I mean, that's the whole rule. I mean, you remember, what was the Whoopi Goldberg Lawrence Block? Was it Burglar?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
I mean, they cast, and it just was like nobody went. It was like you have to have what you have is so everyone's excited that there's this big franchise, right? And there's all this hope that it could this be the next James Bond? Could this be the next Mission Impossible? You've got to nail the first one, right, and set it. And so it's this interesting thing because on the one hand, I'm very hopeful for a bigger, longer run, but all the resources and care has to go into that first one. And then you have to show up and buy a lot of tickets. Those are the two things that need to happen.
Absolutely true. You'll be happy to know the Gray Man will be here next Tuesday. Right. So we'll see. Part of the problem when you get somebody like Ryan Gosling too is that they don't necessarily want to do a franchise. They, he did Drive. James Salas's, and when there was a second book, but Ryan Gosling was like already gone. Matthew McConaughey, if you remember, the first Lincoln lawyer, and so it's a risk to have a big name. It's great for the box office and everything, as you say, but sometimes they don't want to do more than one.
Yeah, and it's cool when you get someone like I was talking about that counter casting, and like when Matt Damon did The Bourne Identity, that was a new move for him. Right? We hadn't quite seen him in that sort of role, so he played in that for a while. And, Daniel Craig with Bond, he came out a great, he had the great Guy Ritchie stuff and Layer Cake. I mean, he obviously was amazing. And, it was either kind of him or Clive Owen for a minute there, but it was still a new thing for him. I think what you don't want is to get someone on their fourth or fifth franchise where they just want to dip in and dip out. But Drive is so exceptional. What an exceptional movie.
It absolutely is. There are just a few little sort of parallels to Evan in terms of where he lives and how, I actually found Rainfall the other day when I was rooting around in the garage. Remember Barry Eisler's first book again?
Sure. Yeah.
But it's very hard to write a character who remains a loner every single book. You know? It just doesn't fly.
Yeah.
I think you've done a wonderful job with
thank
Evan,
you.
bringing him along with these different people. And it's hard to kill them, isn't it? The ones that you eventually leave behind.
It is.
Right. So then we've reached the moment where, first of all, let's give Gregg a round of applause and thank him for coming.
Thank you.
And we've now reached the moment where I'm going to give you a book. It's an advanced reading copy to thank one of you for, how many do we have, Pat? Thank you. To thank you for coming. I really like this book. It's called The Vicar. Inspired by the author's own experience, it introduces Terry Nolan, an MI5 operative, who when he discovers his cover is blown and millions of lives are at stake, will do whatever it takes to stop the enemy forces. It's really a cool book. We've sold quite a lot of them. In fact, this is a slightly older from last September advanced reading copy. So if you would pick a number between 1 and 26, we'll give it away.
10.
Have to be here to win. If 10 it didn't make it, then we'll pick another number. Are you 10? Yay, your book. All right. Thank you so much for coming. I will give it to you. So we've reached the point where we have to ask you to move the furniture. So if you would fold up your chairs and lean them on that wall, they slide off this wall, so don't do that because you'll cut your feet right out from under you. And if you would line up by number, Gregg can stay here and sign books and you should make him flash his jacket.